Hey, you're listening to the Centre podcast. We're a church based in Dural, Sydney, who love Jesus and so want to make him the centre of our lives, our community, and our world. We're going to learn how to do that right now as we sit down and unpack Sunday's sermon. All right. Well, hello. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you listening back to Banter this fine Tuesday morning. My name's Murray.
My name's Mitch.
And we're here to unpack Sunday's sermon. So, yeah. Mitch, I wasn't there in person. I've watched it back. I've listened to it. It was a great sermon reflecting on a pretty tremendous life, a faithful life, and a life of someone who really underwent some real trial and stayed steadfast in all of that. For you, William Carey obviously is someone that is quite inspiring for you. What is it for you that William Carey is most impressive about him?
It's his ordinariness, if that's a word. Just how ordinary he was as a person. There's another quote of his. He goes, "I just plod." He just sort of plodded along in life. It's good thing about Google. You can read so much on his life, and just to refresh for Sunday, just going through some Christianity Today articles, and they just have like little heading. It just said unexceptional beginnings. Just born in this obscure little rural village, unexceptional family, pretty poor, shoe cobbler, but taught himself. Basically, kind of became self-educated. Sort of mentioned on Sunday he loved reading about like James Cook's travels about the world, and that's sort of how he developed an interest in mission. And I think that's what I find inspiring about him, is he wasn't this sort of wealthy, brilliant man. He was someone who was super humble, but understood what Jesus' calling upon the church was, and really stood up against the culture of hyper-Calvinism in that day. So hyper-Calvinist is basically the view that, well, man really has no say in any matter. It's that's why I call it hyper, because Calvinism believes that man's predestined and you can't sort of, quench God. If God wants to call you, you have no say in the matter. You're the elect. Sure. Hyper-Calvinist goes like one step more. Basically, you almost see like yourselves as robots and God's just... So the view was, well, why do mission? If God's called them, he'll do it. Yeah. And that was that's when he got up and said about the need for mission. It's like, young man, you're an enthusiast, sit down. If God's going to call the heathen, he will not call you or I. And it's like, what? That was really bold to do that in that era. And I think that's what I find admirable about it. And the fact that he suffered, which sounds weird, that you find inspiration from suffering, but I do. The fact that he underwent so much hardship and kept going is inspirational. And he wasn't this sort of superhuman guy. He just persevered. And in one of those quotes I had on Sunday, when after he just said, "I'm in a strange land, no Christian friend, a large family, nothing to supply their wants." And he's like, well, I have God and his word is sure. And so there's this like, okay, I'm just going to trust in God. And didn't mean that life was sunshine and roses, but kept a faithfulness in the midst of challenges. And so and I think too, as sort of someone who's oftentimes doesn't see a lot of fruit in ministry, you sort of strive and you talk to people and you hope that people come to faith, and it's like, and it can get very discouraging to see. Well, like took Carey 7 years before his first convert, and that's hard yakka. In that time, a lot of sickness, death, his wife going insane, being abandoned by his other colleague, and just and not taking any time off. 41 years. Just in India. So that's what I find inspiring about the guy, is that God uses very ordinary people. And we sort of can say that, like, God uses ordinary people, but actually seeing someone like him, how God raised him up, I find that deeply inspiring. It's like, well, okay, God can use me too. And who knows what impact that will have. And so, from human point of view, 700 converts by the end of 41 years out of a country of millions is not great statistics, but it's more the legacy that he left. He inspired Hudson Taylor and the Wesleys, and was really the father of what we call the modern mission movement. And that whole starting to become more contextual in mission.
Right.
So he really pioneered that real that sort of era where a lot of Western missionaries went out to proclaim the gospel. So,
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's hard to not be impressed by his, just continual persistence. 7 years is a long time to be in a foreign country where you're not having a lot of fun. Like, it is pretty, phenomenal. And then I think it must have been outside of the sermon you're mentioning. Did he start at some orphanages as well?
So that was George Mueller.
That was George Mueller. That was George Mueller. Okay, sorry, I'm mixing up our great man of Christian faith. But I mean, look, the fact that he lost one of his kids to malaria, it's pretty phenomenal, and it is something which I think is challenging for us because for me, in my sort of walk, I think I've gotten my head around the idea of people needing to undergo persecution for their faith in a very one-to-one way. What I mean by that is other human beings persecuting you for your faith. And look, I don't claim to fully understand the depth of that in any way, but I think there's a part of me that can really get my head around, okay, God has called us to go out into the world, and we will be persecuted by, the community and by people at times for our faith. This seems like a much more epic type of persecution that he's going through, and it is kind of hard to fully wrestle with this idea of suffering when his intentions seem so good, or at least his work is so in line with the gospel. It's a real wrestle, and I can only imagine that he would have had moments where that was the case, where he's kind of calling out and thinking, why God, why God? You obviously kind of brought up this idea of expect great things, attempt great things, and I think that there's some real interesting ideas there where that's 7 years of expectation.
Yes.
Going to. But also attempting great things and aligning that with our 24 baptisms in 2024. And then sort of wove into this image that Carey uses in his sort of famous sermon, Isaiah 54, which I might just read again for us, just to get it fresh in our mind. Isaiah 54, 2-3. Enlarge the place of your tent. Stretch your tent curtains wide. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. For you will spread out to the right and to the left. Your descendants will dispossess nations and settle in their desolate cities. There's a lot of imagery there that really strikes me, but you sort of said you want to unpack a little bit more about the context of that, what's going on in the wider context of Isaiah 53 as well, before moving into Isaiah 54.
Yeah, so Isaiah sort of can be split into two parts. Chapters 1-39 really deal with the Assyrian crisis in the 8th century. And then there's sort of a pause in chapter 40. It seems to be talking to the Babylonian exile. So it's sort of jumping 200 years into the future. And so, if you go to Bible college, that part of Isaiah is called Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah. So some people think there's two Isaiah. Anyway, the point is that whether it's like the Isaiah from the 8th century or a later Isaiah or whatever, the point is that so the first half of Isaiah is about the Assyrian crisis, and that chapter 39 sort of ends with King Hezekiah showing the Babylonians his treasury, and Isaiah's like, "What are you doing, man?" This is a sort of paraphrase. "What are you doing? This is not good, and God's going to bring judgment." Hezekiah's like, "Oh well, it's not in my lifetime, so I don't really care." And then it sort of jumps to 40, and when we're interested, so Isaiah 40, which I'll just pull up now, actually begins the Gospel of Mark. So it says, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for her sins." And so it's almost like 39 anticipates the Babylonian exile, and then 40 sort of kind of jumps ahead, skips all like the horror of 587 and sort of speaking to the people in Babylon. And so 40's there is like comfort. It's like, okay, the sin of being paid for, exile's done, now it's time to come home. And so Walter Brueggemann calls this part of Isaiah the homecoming, so getting prepared to go home. And in these chapters, we're introduced to a figure called the servant. And there's, some debate about who is this person. Now, Christians would identify the servant as Jesus, and that's what the apostles do. And the early church writings definitely sort of point that way. Probably Jewish would see the servant as representative of the nation of Israel. But kind of summarize, Israel's called to be a holy nation, like God's servant, to be holy, and they're not holy. And so there needs to be this servant raised up who will lead the people back into holiness. And so that's the role the servant is, to sort of suffer to bring about this change. And Isaiah 53, it's a very, very famous passage for Christians. And it talks about him, like he growing up like a tender shoot. It's Isaiah 53 too. Like a root out of the ground, had no beauty or majesty to attract us, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. And so it seems, as reading through the eyes of Jesus, that clearly seems to be pointing to Jesus. And he takes up our pain and our suffering, pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that was upon him, that brought us peace, on him, by his wounds we're healed. And then the classic Isaiah 53:6, if you know your Cole, bar bar do bar bar, Isaiah 53:6. Right, cheap. And so Isaiah 53 really talks about, this servant that's crushed and oppressed for our sake. And so when Carey preached that passage from 54, look, we really are speculating here, but a number of people saying, well, William Carey seemed to know his Bible. He wouldn't have picked this passage just because he liked the image of a tent. He seemed to be pointing to something, which would be really fascinating to see what the actual sermon had. Yeah. So you look at 53 and those sort of verses that we looked at on Sunday and talking about, yet it was the Lord, this is from verse 10, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And it's interesting, it's like, okay, who's his offspring? And so, and then you kind of keep reading about how he suffers, he's going to get rewarded, the servant will justify many, he'll be given a portion among the great, divide the spoils among the strong. And so, this idea, okay, this servant's going to suffer, and his offspring he will see. So it's like, okay, he's going to die, but then also see his offspring. Like, it's kind of anticipating, in many ways, Jesus' death and resurrection. And so then when you jump to chapter 40, you're like, okay, we kind of got in the back of our head this suffering servant who will see his offspring. Then suddenly we shift to 54. Sing, barren woman, you who never bore a child, burst into song, shout for joy, you who were never in labour, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband, says the Lord. And so clearly Isaiah here is riffing off the matriarchs of Israel, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, all of them, all these sort of, even Hannah to an extent. And so and oftentimes in the prophets, cities are represented by women. And so Israel, or Jerusalem I should say, has become this barren city in exile. And so now, just like Sarah was given the promise that through her, Abraham and Sarah I should say, but through them that they would have many descendants. So in the same way, this barren woman now, she can rejoice because it's going to have children. And the idea being it's not just a literal woman, there seems to be something deeper, a city. And so when we think about the New Testament, the church is described as the bride of Christ. And so, I find it interesting. You've got this servant imagery who's described as having offspring, and then 54 you've got this barren woman who's going to have lots of kids. And then the next verse is when you talk about the tent spreading. And so what is cool here, and I have some little notes, so this is from a book called from Greg Beale about the temple as the dwelling place of God. And so Beale here talks about how this Isaiah 54, 2 and 3, it points to Genesis 28, and it's the only time in Genesis 28:14 it says, I'm just quoting from him from his book, he says, it's the only promise that contains the precise wording that Abraham's seed will spread out to affect the nations. And so, this idea. So in Hebrew, the word seed, zerah, which we sometimes translate as offspring or children. Zerah is a bit like the English word sheep. It can be singular or plural. And so, actually Genesis 28 is also interesting, because if I pull that up, I should have pulled this up earlier. So Genesis 28:14 is actually around Jacob's dream at Bethel. And so, as Jacob's, he escaped from his brother Esau after sort of, tricking Isaac, his father, from the birthright. And here, when he has this dream at Bethel, which means place of God, and the stairway up to heaven, and the angels descending, and it says here, this is verse 14, your descendants. So that should be Zerah in Hebrew. So Zerah, your offspring, Zerah, descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring, your Zerah. And so Bill's saying, well, that verse, so Genesis 28:14 is riffing off Genesis 1:28, which is be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue and rule it. And so now Jacob's been given, like, he's following Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. That's commission, that promise, that all the world will be blessed through the children of Israel, which ends riffing off the blessing given to Adam and Eve at creation. And so he's saying these allusions here in Isaiah 54 are pointing to that this is sort of the fulfillment of what Jacob saw at Bethel, this spreading out of a tent. So, I have no idea if Carey was thinking about that, but this is what's really cool. And it's interesting, like I said, it's a really interesting passage to choose to encourage people into world mission. Like if you got a hyper-Calvinist era, and he's written, I always forget the title of the book. I just always call it The Inquiry. Inquiry
into the meaning of evangelism.
No. Where is it? I wrote it down somewhere. Anyway, the inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. What a mouthful. So he's just written that in this hyper-Calvinist era, and he picks this passage, which just stick with Matthew 28, surely. So, there's something deeper going on there. And as the massive Old Testament nerd I am, this part of me is like, Carey, what a man. Picking the Old Testament, recognizing the deeper sort of intertextual sort of allusions that are happening. And then two from Isaiah. So in Isaiah 51, let me just pull that up. All these things. So there's one of the hard things about reading prophecy is that some chapters you get these questions or connections that come up. And so, Isaiah 51, it says, listen to me who pursue righteousness, you who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from who you cut, and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who gave you birth. When I called him, he was only one man, and I blessed him and made him many. And so Isaiah 51, 3 chapters earlier, sort of it's like, hey, remember the promise I've given? And now 54 is sort of picking up on that imagery. And then if we even jump back further to chapter 49, so the Old Testament starts to get quite dense as you start to dig in a bit deeper.
It's playing on a lot of textual allusions from previous things.
And so then in Isaiah 49, from verse 12, it says here, but Zion said, so Jerusalem, Zion, has been personified as a woman. The Lord has forsaken me, the Lord has forgotten me. And it's saying, well, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? And so throughout Isaiah, it's been sort of building up this tension of the exiles, of Zion, the woman personified, and the barren one's sort of like, I've been forgotten, I've been forsaken. And God's saying, no, I haven't forgotten you. And then 51, it's like, remember the promise I've given to Abraham? And then in 54, it's sort of talking about, the tent's enlarging, all these sort of images that have been building up are now coming through. And the servant's quite connected to that. And so that's where 53 plays that pivotal role of the one who suffers in order to justify many so that they can enter into Jerusalem. And then And one more sort of cool little reference from Isaiah. In chapter 30, Jerusalem is also described as a tent. And and so that's where those images in. Well, that's fine, Isaiah 30. It's a problem with my notes. I have nearly 5,000 words of notes. This is what I do when I start to prepare sermons and have
brain dump.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like trying to find them all. Anyway, I can't find the document. But in Isaiah 30, there talks about like Jerusalem being this this tent whose pegs aren't pulled apart. It remains firm and steadfast. And so that idea of tents, as I mentioned on Sunday, it's what the early patriarchs did. There's a cool little reference in Genesis chapter 10 in the genealogy, which Table of Nations, which no one probably ever reads. Let's be honest. If you're
or
Genesis,
at the very least skims.
Yeah, you're like, oh my goodness, I just don't care about this stuff. And and sort of you got Shem, and they're these sort of like people that aren't very good. They sort of by like world standards, they sort of live in tents. They're not building cities or doing anything fancy or impressive, but they live in tents. And that's that idea is that, well, actually, that's what God wants. It's actually the tent dwellers that he desires. And so, and that's how like Abraham lives for so long. He lives in like a tent with God's presence. And so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob too, like he's sort of, they're kind of in the land, not in the land, living in tents. And
sojourners, wanderers.
And that's the ideal mode, is in the desert, God's there in a tent with them. And so now personifying, the barren woman with lots of children, enlarging the tent. It's this idea. This is like the ideal mode of being with God. And so, that's a very, very complex and long-winded way of unpacking William Carey's sermon. But, and trying to understand his motives. But if you're kind of a bit lost and confused, that's okay. The simple answer is, like, Carey probably understood, because of what Jesus has done as a suffering servant, he has now created a set of offspring that all nations can be part of. And God's desire is to spread out that tent for the city of Jerusalem to be filled, for people to be living with him. And they used the term heathens quite a lot back then, recognizing that the heathens were it's
a bit jarring.
I know, heathens or heathens. He recognized that the heathens at that time, they weren't part of this tent. And they need to join that. And that's what, I imagine drove him and strove him to do what he did. Is that, it's not just, going against that hyper-Calvinist Calvinism of that day. It wasn't just the elect who sit there and just sort of God's just chosen. You actually need to go do something. You need to attempt great things. God will move. God does do stuff, but we need to do it. And that's what, just part of that whole tent imagery I love is that, just imagine. And you do it like, it's a question I ask, like, what image comes to mind when you think of a tent spreading? It's like, well, things getting too full. We have to just keep building because we can't contain what's there. And that's really what Jesus was calling the church to do, is to spread out from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. So.
I can't help but the first thing that I sort of thought of when you were reading it was thinking about the tabernacle and the tent in that way of God's dwelling place. Do you sort of feel like there's any significance there? Obviously, the tent as a domestic dwelling, but also the tent as the dwelling of God and inviting people into that holy space. Which, then kind of goes all the way into, Revelation when, the idea there's no more gates on the city walls, that people are sort of welcomed in. And this idea that, it's not just welcoming people into the family as sort of like a third cousin twice removed, but it's really this idea of allowing them to even... I found it really interesting, that idea of stretch your tent curtains wide, do not hold back, sort of almost... for me, like letting them right into like the holy of holies, like right into the middle of it. I think that is something that is, a good challenge for us, again, looking into, our very bold vision and, sort of goal of 24 baptisms in 24. What does that look like to really bring people in? It's not just, opening the sliding doors on a Sunday. There's this idea of us needing to be stretched as well, which is a kind of fascinating thing, that really there's maybe a certain a reaching out and an uncomfortableness, a growing, a stretching in that as well. I think the reality is, and this is, sort of a little bit of a confession, sometimes on Sunday, I just want to talk to my mates who I already know. Like, that's the reality. I'm like, I haven't seen you all week. Or maybe, if we've sort of missed each other for a few weeks, like, hey, I feel like I haven't spoken to you in quite a while. I think it can be very easy to be tribalistic in maybe a milder sense of just, friend groups and being a little bit cliquey. And I think this idea of stretching seems to, for me, I also think of growing pains and this idea that it's not really comfortable. Is that idea of overextending sometimes. I think that's a really helpful challenge for me anyway, hopefully for some other people, on what that truly looks like. To stretch out the tent curtains wide and spread out to the right and the left. It's not always the comfortable option. It's not always the easy option.
And I guess that comes down to, and I also said too on Sunday about the idea of treasure, is Carey recognised, whether or not he used this language, we recognise where his treasure was, because, if his treasure was on earth, he would have just stayed in England. As a cobbler, poor, but would have had a probably much simpler, easier life.
Marriage, son who's probably still alive.
There's sort of, it's pretty remarkable. They reckon in those days, the average Englishman life expectancy in rural India was 6 months.
The average
life expectancy of like a Westerner living in rural India at that time was 6 months.
Wow. So it's pretty much a death sentence.
Yes, just because of the disease and the food and everything. And so, it was... I remember when I did the Perspectives Missions course before going to Bible college, and the guy running it said, Carey no modern mission agency would have taken him. They would have said, no, you don't qualify. And he says, just shows you how we put our standards onto people. I guess in a way to protect them. But just the psychological and the physiological sort of, ways we assess people now for mission candidacy is so different. They're like, he would not have passed the muster. They would have said, no, you're not going. There's no way. And so, which I find, challenging, because we want to protect people a bit. But also what I find encouraging is that, if someone that in the modern world, like a CMS or even, what's it called now? Not Global Interaction, what are they called? Baptist Mission Australia, SIM, all those would have said, no, you don't qualify. And God, like using someone who in modern terms wouldn't qualify for ministry in that. It's so, and that's stretching. Like you said, he stretched himself massively, and it came with great, I think there was at one point his sister-in-law was there, and they're sort of like, come on, he just go home. Just end this. And it's like, no. And I imagine that, like you said, that pressure. And so, that's stretching. And, we're probably, maybe some of us are called to do what Carey did, radically. But, just being that stretch. Because it is easy to see church as just a bit of a holy huddle social club.
And to not want it to change. Like, there's almost this idea that maybe there's an element that we have to be willing to sacrifice a little bit on what Sunday looks like for us to really see church become everything that God wants it to be. It's tricky.
It's a challenge, and that's a huge challenge.
Always more room in the tent.
And look, I think the thing is like just Carey's, like I said before, his boldness to speak up against the culture at that time. It's easy to read like some 300 years later and go, oh, that's great of him. But then to kind of contextualize, what's the thing that we need to stand up to? It's like, oh man, okay, like that challenges us that that radicalness of it, and that desire to see the kingdom come, to recognize that the Great Commission didn't end with the apostles, it continues with us today. Like, we still have to carry that mandate on. And I often think about this, and like in 70 years time, if I'm still alive and kicking, I'll be 100 and what's that? 135 now, so 70 years, so I'll be 105. Like, that's, even if I'm alive and kicking, probably not doing what I'm doing now. And 70 years isn't that far away, like in the grand scheme of things. But the kingdom is eternal, and that's important to sort of keep, for me, important to keep that mindset of like a time frame of like, well, you're going to pursue something that's just going to fade away and that people are going to forget about, or pursue something that people might forget about, but God doesn't forget about, because it leaves an eternal legacy. And again, which is why I was drawn to that Matthew 6:21 passage for our theme verse and word for the year, treasure. Because it really is, treasure really is just another way to describe your value. What you value the most is what you put your time and energy into. And if you sort of value the here and now, and look, of course, there's elements of the here and now which aren't inherently evil, but if that's your number one priority, well, where's it going to leave you? But if your number one focus is the kingdom, which Jesus says, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, all these things will be given to you, and that's the context of food, water, all that shelter. And in our context, probably self-esteem, self-image, all that stuff, because we're not worried about food and clothing. They'll all be covered if you just keep seeking first the kingdom. And so, that's deeply challenging, but also I think, encouraging, because too, Carey, and there's so many cool missionaries out there and men and women of faith who were just ordinary. They weren't, when we did our saints video last year, those people are kind of crazy, they were the like non-stop praying, or giving up tremendous personal sacrifice, or whatever it was. Like, those monks live very, very I use spiritual inverted commas, like they kind of, some of them locked themselves away. Where I look at a Carey, I'm like, well, this guy was just a normal person who just had a heart. And so I look around our church and I was like, well, God could use any of us to accomplish things if we just have the willingness to be used. And so I would think that about my life. I was like, well, I'm not really anyone that special, but just God to use me in small ways, great ways, whatever it is, but just the privilege of being able to make an eternal impact. That's a cool thing to be part of that legacy. And so be part of tent building, tent making, tent spreading,
tent stretching.
Tent stretching. So
there's, I can't help but think, you can't mention his sister coming to India and being like, hey, like, William, what's going on here, mate? Like, gotta get home. It strikes me that I think a lot of church planting organizations, for instance, say, you need to be able to be financially self-sufficient within 2 years or within 5 years. You've spoken about how Carey himself wouldn't have been, eligible to be a missionary in any of the sort of Australian organizations that we know of. When do you sort of finally say, okay, God, like, maybe you're closing a door here? Like, how do you sort of discern that difference? I'd love to sort of know some of Carey's inner thinkings in like the start of year 7, when there's still not a single person has come to Christ. Like, at what point are we flogging a dead horse? Are we trying to push against a door that God's closing? And at what point is God maturing, so preparing the soil for something? It's a really hard question.
It is incredibly hard. I only read like a chapter of this book because I didn't have time for it, but Fair. It was on so many books I love to read, but it was on waiting for Christ's coming. And it described, like, when we think of waiting, we think of a waiting room, which is boring.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's sometimes part of the righteous. Is that in Scripture, there is this theme of the righteous are patiently waiting. Yeah. And that's what sort of Peter talks about in his letters. It's like, there's going to come a time where scoffers are like, well, it hasn't happened yet, so it's not going to come. And yeah, I often think of like a Noah. It's like he spends a lot of time on that boat waiting for those waters to come down. He sort of sets a bit of a template for that of like, okay, yeah, you're saved, but you're going to have to wait and wait. Yeah, and wait like 150 days till the flood's completely subsided. Or the Israelites, 400 and something years in Egypt. That's a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often think about those that are in year 199, year 260, even year 370, you know, close. You just think, well, God's abandoned us.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, or even like a Moses, 40 days, 40 nights up on the mountain. I don't have an easy answer, but I do know this, is that Scripture sets like a longer time frame than what we are accustomed to. We sort of want something now. A bit like if you want a chocolate from, a vending machine, you stick your $2 in, you get it. There's instant gratification, which is what our society wants. And we probably want that from God too. It's just, well, I've prayed, so it should happen now. I want to see this now. And I'm guilty of that because you want stuff to happen now.
Sure, we all are.
Yeah, I've prayed. I'm like, well, it's been like a week. Why hasn't anything moved? Oh, come on, what are you doing? Hurry up. And so, like how do you know that you're flogging a dead horse, that these doors shut? Yeah, look. Because it comes down to like calling.
Yeah. And
for me, I've always felt the calling as this sort of... Well, coming to Jewel was super interesting because we knew straight away. I remember clearly it was February. So it was probably about 3 years ago, actually, because it's February now, funnily enough.
Yeah.
I remember I was walking to Regent's Park. I saw this almost like X, like a big red X over the building. I was like, okay. Yeah, their season's shut. Like I knew that. And then my first time coming here, it was almost like I saw like this big green tick over the place. I was like, okay, this is... And so that's probably for me, like I've kind of always had that sense of calling, of knowing. Like that's kind of been my relationship with God, is this sense of like, I can't really explain it. It's, sometimes it's almost like real clear, like I know this is what's going to happen. So some might say it's prophetic, or it's just how I've kind of been with big spiritual decisions, felt this. Other times you left kind of like, I have no idea what to do with this. I don't know a way forward. And so it's not a hard and fast answer. There's some matters you pray about, and you're like, I just have no idea what to do here. There's just no clarity on that. But sort of I guess the kind of cliche answer is, well, what do you feel God's calling you to? Well, I suppose for Carey, he felt called to India. And so... recognise that that's where his life was. And so the hardship in that was there, growing him, refining him, shaping him for the person God needed him to be. So, I don't know. But sometimes, sometimes those doors do shut. And there's a sense of peace about that. That's probably too. Like, again, going to Regent's Park, I knew my time was up. I felt a sense of peace that door was closed and time to move on. And so, But sometimes when you're like, just because you're suffering and it feels terrible doesn't mean that it's time to pull the plug. Could just be the season, a long season of just wrestling through. I don't know. It's tough. This is, I guess, part of the challenge of our faith, is that there's no easy answers. We're left in the grey and left to wander and to wonder and to wrestle and to... kind of what Carey said, with that quote, I'm in a strange land, no Christian friends, a large family, nothing to supply their wants, but I have God, and his word is sure. And his other quote that I had on Sunday, this is indeed the valley of the shadow of death to me, but I rejoice that I am here, notwithstanding, and God is here. So it's like, okay, like life sucks right now, but I have this thing as I have God with me, and so that is enough. And so...
I guess what I'm hearing there is really allowing your discernment to affect your decision and not your situation to affect your decision. And I think that, when we hold on to the promises that God has given us and hold on to that calling and who we are, made in the image of God, not the words that, some old dude speaks over you saying that it'll never happen, that is when we can really achieve the things that God has planned for us. And I think it's so tricky because we do live in that, very instant gratification world. But remembering that as well, that as you said, like people were in exile, not just for their whole lives, like for generations. And yet God is still using you as part of a bigger story, that you were just, one player in a grand universal play. But I think that as we sort of come to a close today, really love to sort of look at these 4 centers and maybe just take a second talking about it, because this is sort of a big idea for us heading into 2024. Obviously our 7 centers being Bible-centered, prayer-centered, discipleship-centered, relationship-centered, community-centered, compassion-centered, and mission-centered. The 4 big centers of the week were prayer, missions, relationship, and discipleship. In this, what's sort of the big thing for you? Because this is, I often find when I'm preparing a sermon, I end up going away being like, actually, that's a good idea, God, I should do that. What was the one big thing that stood out for you of those 4 that walking away, you're like,
what sounds funny, probably what great thing is God calling me to do? What extra sort of thing? That's probably what sort of been wrestling with a bit, with some sort of ways forward and kind of achieving our 24 in 24, particularly around that sort of discipleship space of what sort of things might need to like give up and add on, and discerning that. That was probably the big one. And just the praying for what expectant thing, which sounds odd because it's kind of pushing it, but also of like trusting that God will do that. That's probably, and also to trusting that even if we don't do it, if it doesn't happen, that it's not a failure. That we've put this 24 and 24 as kind of, I guess, a human marker to kind of give us something to aim for. But if we get 3 and 24, it's like, oh, well, we failed. Well, no, because we've actually started planting seeds and shifting our church culture to be like more missional, to be more focused on discipleship. And I was like, that in itself's not a failure. We might baptize 48 this year. We might baptize, we're going to baptize at least 2 people. So, but like, I'm not seeing it as a failure, but seeing it as like, well, here's something that we aim for. And if God's, wants to fulfill that, that's awesome. If not, I don't see it as a failure, but I see it as like, well, it's just a step forward. And 2025 is another year, and 26, 27, and so forth. So
so good. I love that idea of 24 and 24 almost being, without being heretical, a bit like the Sermon on the Mount, like it's impossible standard but ultimately like we're going to be better off for striving towards it than not at all, and this is the point, right? I likewise really challenged about that. What expectant thing do I need to be praying for? Because I think it can be a bit tricky sometimes. You can almost feel like you make yourself a bit vulnerable by praying for big things. If you sort of lower your expectations of God, you won't be disappointed. Then you don't need to be, sort of wrestling with that fact when maybe he doesn't answer a big prayer that you prayed for. I think there is actually, I don't know, for me at least, and maybe some other people, like a sense of vulnerability there as well in having a big expectant prayer, because ultimately God might say no, and that'll be a real bummer. Or he might say maybe, and I might have to wait for a lot longer than I was maybe hoping for. But I think ultimately God does want us to be praying not just for the little things, but for the big things and for the expectant things and for the future. So a really, I think, good challenge for me. But no, really appreciate it, mate. And I think that this story of William Carey can only help but encourage us both in the good times and the difficult times, for sure.
Like I said on Sunday, there's so many good free like just YouTube docos on him. Just type William Carey into YouTube, and there's good like 90-minute documentaries, and there's and for kids too. There's the YouTube channel is, let me just pull it up. It's Vision or something. It's like a Christian. It does a lot of Christian.
Yeah, cool.
Let me just go to my subscriptions. Anyway, it's called Torch Finders. Is the name of, like, originally they're on DVD, but they're just, I guess the world now has gone digital, and it's just on But you can watch for kids like cartoon they're really well done cartoon movies on famous like Christians. So different, like they have Augustine. They've got St. Patrick from Ireland. They've got I've forgotten the name, like one of the first female martyrs from like the 2nd century. And they're I'll just type torch finders. And it's just there on.
Well, I mean,
or torch lighters, I should say, not torch finders. No, so if you just type in torch lighters, says these are great. So I've just typed in here the Gladys Aylward story. She was a missionary, led 100 orphans through war-torn China. The Mary Sleesaw story, so another like female missionary. You've got Jim Elliot, the famous martyr. Here's Augustine, George Mueller. Robert Germain, I don't even know who he is. Amy Carmichael, she was another missionary to India. St. Patrick. William Tyndale, who translated the English Bible. So, I find these stories just really encouraging for me. It's like, okay, like I'm not the first Christian, which you should know that, but I'm not and it's inspiring to who God uses. And just to see beyond kind of, because it's a bit depressing. You look at our culture and think, the church is about to die. And it's like, well, actually, like God's raised up people for the last 2,000 years from all walks of life. That's what I like about Torchlight. It's got men, women from all different sort of eras.
That's cool.
And their stories. It's about half an hour long. And so kids and adults can get something out of it. And it's just there on YouTube for free. So,
Thank you, YouTube.
Plug there.
So good. Well, mate, we are continuing along our treasure series, and this Sunday I'm bringing the word around the secret to flourishing is the sermon title that I was given. So I like that little Miroslav Volf article that you've thrown me, which is great. But the idea of love, God, and neighbour.
Did you read the article?
I haven't read the article yet. I've got to do it this afternoon. But I think the big thing that I'm also intrigued by is this idea of the golden rule. And the idea of it being something which is not just in Christianity, but pretty much in every major religion. And how does Christianity take that golden rule and make it different? I think that should be a really, really fun time to look into. That ultimately, in a age that is obsessed with comfort and flourishing, what does a Christian flourishing look like? So it should be really fun. I think definitely a good challenge for some of us, maybe to love our very literal neighbours as well. I know I'm going to a strata meeting on Thursday. That's going to be really fun. So it's going to be a good challenge for me, definitely on a more literal level. So it should be a good one. Well, mate, thanks for the message.
Thank you. And we'll see you on Sunday.
See you then. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to help others discover this channel. Check out the description if you want to find out more or get in touch with us at the Centre Dural. But in the meantime, praying for God's hand over you as you continue to step into everything Jesus has in store for your life. Be blessed.